Between May and November 2011, two BBC journalists compiled more than 30 hours of testimony from women who said Jimmy Saville had abused them. By the 1st of December, the investigation was dead, killed by the very institution that employed both the reporters and the predator. But Newsnight wasn't the first warning. Women had gone to police in 2007, to hospitals, to schools, to anyone who would listen, and some who refused to. They warned us, repeatedly, formally, on the record. This is the story of what happened to those warnings and to the women who made them. Liz McKean and Miriam Jones began their work in the shadow of silence. In May 2011, they set out to gather not just allegations but evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of lawyers and editors alike. Every step was deliberate. They spoke with women whose stories had gone unheard for decades, recording more than 30 hours of interviews over 6 months. Some testimonies came from hospital wards, others from BBC studios, and still more from the private spaces where victims had carried their memories in isolation. Each account was documented, cross-checked, and, when possible, corroborated with official records, police complaint logs, internal BBC memos, and survivor statements dating back to the 1970s. The process was exhaustive. McKean and Jones did not rely on second-hand accounts or anonymous tips. They traveled across the country, sitting with survivors who had reported abuse to police, to school officials, or to hospital administrators, only to be dismissed or ignored. They secured copies of formal complaints, traced the paper trail through Freedom of Information requests, and compared survivor stories against institutional files. In several cases, they found references to Saville in hospital visitor logs and BBC access records, matching dates and locations described in victim testimony. The journalists' approach was methodical. Interviews were recorded with consent, and each transcript was reviewed for accuracy. Where the BBC's legal team flagged a risk, McKean and Jones returned to the source, seeking further clarification or supporting documents. They worked late into the night, building a file that would meet the highest standards of investigative reporting. By November 2011, their dossier included hours of video and audio, sworn statements, and a timeline that linked Saville to multiple sites of alleged abuse. The evidence was not just anecdotal, it was layered, consistent, and supported by documentation that had, until then, sat unexamined in institutional archives. The weight of the material became impossible to ignore. Survivors described patterns of behavior that matched across decades and locations. Some had tried to report Saville to the police as early as 2007, others had approached the BBC directly, only to be told there was no case to answer. McKean and Jones tracked these earlier warnings, documenting the dates and outcomes of each attempt. They found that in 2009, Surrey police had interviewed Saville under caution after a complaint from Duncroft School, but the case was closed with no prosecution. The journalists included this police file in their evidence pack, alongside internal BBC emails referencing Saville's unusual access to hospital wards and children's programming. By the end of November 2011, the investigation stood on a mountain of testimony and supporting documents. The file was ready for broadcast review. Editors acknowledged the depth of the work, noting that the team had gone further than most internal investigations ever dared. The evidence was clear, the stories credible, and the institutional records, though often redacted, confirmed that warnings had been raised, documented, and left to gather dust. The dossier, assembled with care and precision, was now in the hands of those with the power to act. The question was whether they would. On December 1, 2011, the Newsnight investigation into Jimmy Saville was brought to a halt. The order came not from the immediate editorial team, but from the highest levels of the BBC. Director of BBC Vision George Entwistle signed the cancellation memorandum, reference BBC VI 2011-1206, authorizing the decision. Circulated among senior management, the memo cited legal risk and the proximity of planned tribute programs as reasons to withhold the broadcast. The document's language was careful, referencing the need for further police confirmation and concern for the corporation's reputation. Yet, for those who had spent months gathering evidence, the meaning was unmistakable. The effect was immediate. Liz McKean, who had led the investigation, was summoned to a meeting where she was told the story would not air. The hours of survivor testimony, the corroborating files, the cross-checked timelines, all were to be archived, not broadcast. McKean's emails from this period, later released in redacted form, show her pushing back. She warned that the penultimate paragraph of the official justification was misleading, that police had not been contacted, and that the evidence was being misrepresented. There was no reply that addressed her concerns directly. Instead, the editorial board recorded the decision to remove the story from the Mission Readiness Production List, a bureaucratic phrase that closed the door on months of work. For McKean, the consequences stretched beyond a single story. She was moved off Newsnight and reassigned to a non-frontline role. By early 2015, her contract was not renewed, a fact confirmed in BBC Human Resources records. McKean later described the experience as a professional exile. She spoke publicly about the culture of denial that surrounded the case, naming senior managers who had ordered the investigation killed. In interviews, she described the chilling effect. Colleagues avoided her, legal threats arrived from Saville's estate, and anonymous online attacks painted her as a traitor to the institution. The cancellation memo itself remains a focal point in the documentary record. Its wording, preserved in the BBC written archives, is cited in the Pollard Review as the moment when institutional caution overtook journalistic responsibility. The circulation list included the Director of News and the BBC's legal counsel, ensuring that the decision was not the act of a single editor, but a coordinated, top-level intervention. The rationale, concern for libel, uncertainty about police files, and fear of reputational harm became the shield behind which the story was buried. The personal cost to McKean was steep. She had built a career on reporting uncomfortable truths and now found herself sidelined for doing exactly that. Her departure from the BBC was not marked by public statements or formal dismissal, but by a quiet, enforced absence. The evidence she and Marion Jones had gathered was locked away, its existence acknowledged only in redacted internal emails and the sealed annexes of later reviews. For the women who had spoken to McKean, some for the first time in decades, the cancellation meant another cycle of disbelief. Their accounts, carefully documented and corroborated, were once again set aside by those with the power to act. The BBC's decision to shelve the investigation did not just silence a program, it silenced the women whose stories had been entrusted to it. The machinery of suppression was not loud or dramatic, but systematic and thorough, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and careers quietly dismantled. Mrs. A's voice first entered the record in 1998 during a taped interview for BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour. She described in measured words how Jimmy Saville had touched her inappropriately while she volunteered on a hospital maternity ward. The tape, marked BBC Radio 4, SW 1998-021, was forwarded to the BBC Trust by producer Caroline Logan that September. The trust's response did not dispute her account. Instead, it was filed as a record of concern, with a recommendation for further verification. No inquiry followed. Years later, Mrs. A would testify to the Saville inquiry under a pseudonym, referencing that original interview as proof that her warning had been placed in official hands. In May 2002, Denise Rogers, a schoolteacher, submitted a written complaint to West Yorkshire Police. Her statement alleged that Saville had entered her school after hours and made sexual advances toward a pupil. The file, WSPD 2002-112, included a signed declaration and a list of 4 staff witnesses. Police closed the file as unsubstantiated on June 27, 2002. No interviews were conducted with the named witnesses. Rogers learned of the outcome only by formal letter, which cited insufficient evidence and made no mention of follow-up. More than a decade later, the House of Commons Children's Committee would single out her case as an example of procedural failure. Anna Kay worked as a senior nurse at a large NHS hospital. On October 23, 2008, she reported Saville's presence in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit to the NHS Trust Ethics Committee. She submitted a diary entry and a photocopy of the patient visitor log, which showed Saville's entry on October 9th. The committee's minutes, NHS ET 2008-097, recorded serious concerns about safeguarding, but the matter was not escalated. Anna Kay requested anonymity, fearing professional backlash. Her warning, too, was left at the level of committee minutes, acknowledged but not acted upon. Each of these women took their concerns to the authorities they trusted. They followed official channels, signed statements, and provided supporting evidence. Their names appear in institutional records, a radio producer's log, a police complaint file, a hospital committee's minutes. Each time, the response was procedural, polite, and ultimately passive. The warnings were not dismissed as fabrications. They were simply absorbed into the system, registered and set aside. No action was taken against Saville. No further investigation was launched. The pattern, visible across years and institutions, was not one of disbelief, but of inertia. For these women, the cost was more than personal. Their attempts to protect others became part of a paper trail that would only matter in hindsight when it was already too late. Sally Brown's name appears in the records as a persistent advocate, a woman who refused to let the system forget. On the 2nd of November 2009, she sent a formal letter to the Department of Health, addressed to Secretary of State Andy Burnham. Attached to her letter was a list of 12 alleged victims and a copy of a BBC Newsnight memo referencing Saville's unrestricted access to hospital wards. Brown's correspondence was clear and direct, urging an urgent review of previous complaints, including the earliest known formal police report, Surrey Police File S 2007-018. The letter was received, logged, and circulated internally. An internal Health Watch review was triggered, but the process stopped there. The file was shelved. The review was quietly closed, and no public action followed. Surrey Police's own records confirm the existence of file S 2007-018. The complaint, lodged in 2007, described an indecent assault at a school garden party. The victim was 12 years old. The file was opened, assigned a case number, and reviewed by the Historic Sexual Abuse Unit. No prosecution followed. Senior officers cited insufficient evidence. The file was closed, but not destroyed. It remained in the archives, referenced in later correspondence, but never escalated to a full investigation. When Brown's 2009 letter arrived, it cited this file directly, pressing the authorities to revisit the decision. The response was procedural. The letter was acknowledged, the file was reviewed for completeness, and the matter was left unresolved. Brown's efforts did not end with a single letter. She testified before the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee in 2013, describing the pattern of institutional inertia she had encountered. Her warnings, like those of others, were absorbed into the administrative machinery. The Department of Health's Freedom of Information response, filed as FOI 2010-156, confirms that Brown's letter was received and that an internal review took place. Yet the outcome was silence. The BBC, too, received copies of her correspondence. Internal emails, later cited in the Dame Janet Smith review, reference Brown's advocacy but offer no evidence of substantive follow-up. The warnings were acknowledged, filed, and left to gather dust. The pattern extends across agencies. Between 2007 and 2011, Surrey Police logged at least 5 complaints naming Saville. Each was assigned a reference number, each reviewed, and each closed without prosecution. The institutional response was consistent: record, review, defer. The BBC's internal memos reflect the same approach. Concerns about Saville's presence in hospitals and schools were noted in staff emails and meeting minutes, but rarely escalated to senior management. When they were, the response was cautious: legal risk, reputational harm, insufficient evidence. For Sally Brown and the women she represented, escalation meant entering a labyrinth of polite deferral and bureaucratic delay. Their warnings were not dismissed as fabrications. They were registered, acknowledged, and absorbed into a system designed to manage risk rather than confront it. The documentary trail, letters, police files, departmental responses remains incomplete, with key documents still sealed in archives. What survives is the record of repeated formal attempts to force action and the clear evidence that those attempts were systematically contained. The cost of that containment is measured in the hundreds of victim statements that would only surface years later when institutional silence could no longer hold. On the 13th of January 2012, the Daily Mail published an editorial that distilled the skepticism running through much of the British press. The headline, set above a story about the BBC's decision to shelve its Newsnight investigation, questioned not just the allegations against Saville, but the motives of those raising them. The editorial described the claims as unproven and warned against the dangers of media witch hunts, a phrase that would echo across tabloid columns and broadcast panels for months to come. In the absence of a televised exposé, the press narrative defaulted to caution, framing the story as a risk to reputations rather than a matter of public safety. Other newspapers adopted a similar stance. The Telegraph, in a late January opinion piece, cited the BBC's internal meeting minutes and concluded that the corporation was right to be wary of trial by media. The Guardian, while more measured, still reported on the internal resistance at the BBC as a bureaucratic tussle, not as a failure to protect vulnerable people. Across the spectrum, editorial voices questioned the reliability of survivor testimony, often invoking Saville's charity work and public persona as a counterweight to the emerging allegations. These headlines did more than shape public opinion. They set the boundaries for what could be discussed. Editors and columnists, invoking legal caution and the presumption of innocence, made it easier for institutions to justify inaction. The result was a press environment where even credible warnings struggled to gain traction. The women who spoke out found their accounts filtered through layers of editorial doubt. Their credibility weighed against the risk of libel and the legacy of a national figure. The record of this period is not just one of institutional silence, but of a media narrative that minimized, questioned, and ultimately contained the story until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Freedom of information requests promised a path through the fog. In theory, the BBC and public agencies were required to release internal records on request, with only narrow grounds for redaction. In practice, the documents that surfaced often arrived with entire paragraphs blacked out, names replaced by initials, and legal advice reduced to a single line of dots. The reference FOIBBC 2012-019 stands as a case in point. Filed after the Newsnight cancellation, the request sought all internal emails and decision memos concerning Saville's investigation. The response came as a PDF, its pages dominated by thick bands of black ink. Subject lines remained: Saville urgent, editorial risk assessment, legal review confidential. Beneath them, the substance was gone. Each justification for redaction cited legal privilege, personal data, or corporate confidentiality. The effect was not simply to withhold names, but to erase the logic of decision-making itself. Chains of correspondence broke mid-sentence. Attachments referenced in the body of an email were omitted entirely. Where the request asked for the rationale behind shelving the Newsnight story, the response offered a single visible phrase: "In light of ongoing legal advice, it is recommended," followed by a full redaction block. The FOIBBC 2012-019 packet became less a record of accountability and more a display of institutional self-protection. For those seeking answers, the redactions were a message in their own right. The machinery of secrecy was not accidental, nor was it the work of a lone official. Each blacked-out page reflected a process, reviewed by legal, signed off by management, and preserved in the archives as evidence of compliance rather than transparency. The truth was not denied, but withheld, buried under layers of process. Only when the story broke outside the BBC on a rival network did the full cost of secrecy become clear. On the evening of 3 October 2012, ITV broadcast Exposure: The Other Side of Jimmy Saville. The program aired at 11:10 p.m., opening with the faces and voices of women who had lived for decades with secrets that no one wanted to hear. Their accounts were specific, detailed, and, for the first time, broadcast to the nation without filter or qualification. The documentary did not rely on rumor or innuendo. It presented on-camera testimony from survivors, hospital staff, and former school pupils, each describing abuse that had been ignored or dismissed by authorities for years. Within hours, the impact was measurable. ITV's press office recorded over 1,000 calls and emails from viewers, many of them describing experiences that echoed what had just been aired. By midday, the Metropolitan Police confirmed they had received a surge of new allegations, each one logged and assigned a case number. The BBC, caught off guard, issued a brief statement acknowledging the seriousness of the claims and announcing its own internal review. But the story had already broken containment. In the days following the broadcast, the scale of response grew with every news cycle. National newspapers that had previously treated the subject with caution now ran front-page stories. Radio phone-ins and online forums filled with disclosures, some from adults, others from people who had been children when the abuse occurred. Survivor advocacy groups reported a sudden spike in calls to their helplines, with some organizations doubling their casework overnight. The sense of collective release was unmistakable. For years, Warnings had been registered and set aside. Now each new voice added to a growing chorus that could no longer be ignored. The police response was immediate and public. On 12 October 2012, just 9 days after the broadcast, the Metropolitan Police launched Operation U-Tree. The operation began with 120 lines of inquiry and soon identified more than 300 possible victims. By February 2013, that number would climb past 450, with allegations stretching back to the 1950s and involving children, hospital patients, and vulnerable adults. Statements poured in from across the country: London, Leeds, Manchester, Glasgow, each one a fragment of a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. Official press releases from the Metropolitan Police described the investigation as unprecedented in scope. Detectives worked through weekends, sorting statements, cross-referencing dates, and contacting witnesses who had never before spoken to authorities. Many victims described having tried to report the abuse in earlier decades, only to be dismissed or told there was insufficient evidence. Others recounted failed attempts to raise concerns inside the BBC or the NHS, their warnings lost in layers of bureaucracy and legal caution. The data told its own story. By the end of October, the police had logged more than 200 new allegations. By the close of 2012, the total would surpass 450. Operation U-Tree became a national audit, not just of Saville's crimes, but of the institutions that had enabled them. The BBC, under pressure, commissioned the Dame Janet Smith Review to examine its own culture and practices. NHS trusts launched their own investigations, combing through decades of visitor logs and staff records. Each inquiry uncovered further evidence of missed warnings and systemic failure. For the women who had spoken up, some on ITV, others in police interviews or anonymous letters, the sudden surge in disclosures was both vindication and a reminder of what had been lost. Their testimonies, once sidelined or doubted, now formed the backbone of a criminal investigation and a national reckoning. The machinery of denial had been forced into reverse, not by a single revelation, but by the collective weight of hundreds of voices refusing to be silenced any longer. The exposure broadcast did not end the story. It detonated it. The surge of victims coming forward transformed a private scandal, long managed behind closed doors, into a public crisis that demanded answers from every institution involved. The numbers, 450 victims, dozens of hospitals, and multiple decades, became the evidence of what happens when warnings are ignored and when women who tell the truth are believed only after it is far too late. The Dame Janet Smith Review, published in October 2016, stands as the most comprehensive institutional reckoning with the BBC's handling of the Saville allegations. The report runs to over 700 pages, yet its central findings are stated with clarity and finality. Dame Janet Smith, a former High Court judge, concluded that multiple senior managers at the BBC were aware of allegations against Saville during his lifetime. They received warnings from staff, survivors, and even internal memos, but failed to act. The review draws directly from archived correspondence, meeting minutes, and interviews with key figures, including former Newsnight journalists, BBC executives, and staff who had raised concerns. In her executive summary, Dame Janet Smith writes, "There is no evidence that the BBC as a corporate body knew that Saville was a sexual predator. However, there is ample evidence that some members of staff did know and that management at various levels failed to take appropriate steps." The report specifies that at least 7 separate managers received credible warnings about Saville's conduct between the late 1960s and the 2000s. These included direct reports from junior staff, complaints from members of the public, and references in internal safeguarding reviews. Yet, in each instance, the institutional response was to defer, to seek further confirmation, or to file the matter without escalation. The review examines the handling of the Newsnight investigation in detail. It finds that the decision to shelve the program in December 2011 was seriously flawed. The rationale offered, legal risk, and the timing of tribute broadcasts did not stand up to scrutiny. Dame Janet's report cites internal emails and memos, including the cancellation memorandum signed by the director of BBC Vision, George Entwistle, as evidence that senior management prioritized reputation over transparency. The report notes that the memo's circulation list included the Director of News, the BBC Legal Counsel, and heads of editorial policy, ensuring that the decision was not the act of a single editor, but a collective top-level intervention. Paragraph 9.3.12 of the report addresses the culture that enabled this inaction. The BBC had a culture of not wanting to rock the boat. Staff were reluctant to report concerns about talent, especially someone as powerful as Saville. There was an atmosphere of fear and a belief that complaints would not be taken seriously. The review documents how junior staff who raised concerns were often told to keep quiet, or that their careers might suffer if they persisted. The testimony of women who tried to escalate their warnings is quoted throughout. One former producer is recorded as saying, "I was told, don't pursue this. You'll never work here again." The review's findings are supported by a catalogue of missed opportunities. In at least 3 separate instances, 1973, 1982, and 1999, formal complaints about Saville's behavior were logged by BBC departments. Each time, the complaint was either dismissed as unsubstantiated or left unresolved. The report notes that in 1999, a written warning about Saville's access to hospital wards was circulated among senior management, yet no action was taken to restrict his movements or investigate further. The review concludes that these failures were not the result of a lack of information, but of a systemic unwillingness to confront the possibility that a celebrated figure could be a danger to vulnerable people. Dame Janet Smith's conclusions extend beyond the BBC. The review references parallel failures by police and NHS trusts, noting that information about Saville's conduct was often shared between agencies but never acted upon. The report's language is measured, but the weight of its findings is unmistakable. It states, had the BBC acted promptly and decisively on the warnings it received, many victims would have been spared. The publication of the Dame Janet Smith review in October 2016 was accompanied by a formal apology from the BBC's Director General. The review's recommendations included the establishment of new safeguarding protocols, mandatory reporting of all allegations, and independent oversight of complaints involving high-profile staff. The BBC accepted all recommendations in full. Yet, for the women who had tried to warn the BBC, some of whom had lost jobs, reputations, or years of peace, the report was both an acknowledgement and a reminder. Their warnings had been credible, their efforts documented. The institutional failure to listen is now a matter of public record, preserved in the language of an official inquiry. The cost of that failure, measured in lives upended and trust broken, cannot be redacted or filed away. Today, official records remain sealed, and the women who spoke out still wait for true accountability. Institutions once trusted to protect, instead chose silence, a silence that echoes in every new scandal left unheeded. When warnings are dismissed, harm multiplies, behind closed doors and in plain sight. The test now is not whether we hear, but whether we act. Justice begins only when every voice is counted.